You can smell betrayal before you even see it. In my case, it smelled like fresh carpet cleaner, lemon polish, and the sickeningly sweet scent of my mother's favorite vanilla candle burning way too bright on a Tuesday afternoon. But worse than the smell was the silence. A house that holds a grand piano breathes differently. The wood settles, the strings hum faintly when a heavy truck drives by outside. But that day, the air in my parents' living room felt dead. The silence was heavy, choking, and it hit me before we even turned the corner into the main room. My brother had done the unthinkable. He had sold my 12-year-old son's future, a gift meant to nurture a rare talent, just to feed his own endless, pathetic ego. And my parents stood right there and watched him do it. You have to understand, we didn't just lose an instrument. We lost a piece of my son's soul, stolen and traded for $185,000 of cold, hard cash. What kind of family does that? I am about to tell you exactly how this nightmare started, and more importantly, how it ended. I parked my work truck in the driveway of my parents' suburban home, the same driveway I had scraped ice off for years, while my older brother slept in. Next to me in the passenger seat was my son, Ronan. He is 12, quiet, and sees the world entirely through music. He had his sheet music folded neatly in his lap, his fingers already tapping a silent rhythm on his knees. We lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, which was barely big enough for our beds, let alone a grand piano. So, when my grandfather moved into an assisted living facility, he left his prized antique grand piano at my parents' house, explicitly for Ronan to play and practice on. Ronan unbuckled his seatbelt with a small, rare smile on his face. He loved practicing here. Not because he loved his grandparents' cold, sterile house, but because he loved the piano. It was his safe space. We walked up the path, and I unlocked the front door. I still had a key, mostly because my parents needed someone to check on the plumbing or fix the roof when things went wrong. I pushed the door open, letting Ronan walk in first. He took his shoes off by the mat, just like he was taught, and walked down the hallway toward the sunken living room. I followed a few steps behind, carrying my work bag. I saw Ronan stop dead in his tracks. His shoulders stiffened. He dropped his sheet music. The papers scattered across the hardwood floor with a soft rustle. I rushed forward, my heart skipping a beat. When I reached him, I looked past his small frame into the living room. The piano was gone. It was a massive, beautiful instrument, taking up a full third of the room. Now there was just an empty space. You could literally see the deep dents in the thick carpet where the heavy brass casters had rested for years. There was a fresh square of sunlight hitting the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the empty air. Ronan did not scream. He did not cry. He just stood there, his hands trembling at his sides, staring at the empty space like a ghost had just walked through him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and panicked, searching my face for an answer I did not have. Before I could even speak, my mother, Veda, strolled out of the kitchen. She was holding a mug of herbal tea, her hair perfectly styled, wearing a crisp blouse like she was ready for a magazine photo shoot. She looked at the empty space, then at us, and her expression did not change. Not even a flinch. "Oh, you boys are here early," she said, her voice light and breezy, taking a sip of her tea. "Mom," I said, my voice low, trying to keep the panic out of my throat for Ronan's sake. "Where is the piano?" Veda waved her free hand dismissively. "Oh, that old dust collector? Your father called some technicians to take it away for maintenance. It is so old, Gideon. It was getting dusty, and frankly, it was ruining the feng shui of the room. We needed the space to breathe." "Maintenance?" I repeated, my blood running cold. "You sent a priceless antique away for maintenance without telling me? Without telling Ronan?" My father, Orson, walked in from the garage at that exact moment. He was wiping his hands on a rag, looking annoyed that we were even there. Orson has always carried himself like a king in a very small castle. "What is the yelling about?" Orson grumbled. "Where is Ronan's piano?" I asked, stepping between my father and my son. Orson sighed heavily, rolling his eyes. "Gideon, do not make a mountain out of a molehill. It is out for repairs. Besides, he looked down at Ronan with a sneer. The boy has been slacking on his practice anyway. Taking a few weeks off will not hurt him. Play outside. Get some fresh air. Ronan flinched like he had been slapped. He had not missed a day of practice in 3 years. He practiced until his fingers cramped. He lived for that piano. I looked back at my mother. She was still sipping her tea, looking out the window as if this conversation was boring her. Then, my eyes drifted to the glass coffee table in the center of the room. Sitting right on top of a stack of home decor magazines was a glossy, thick catalog. The cover featured a massive, state-of-the-art recreational vehicle, a luxury RV. It was open to a page showing a model that cost more than my entire apartment. A sick, twisting feeling knotted in my stomach. My parents did not camp. They hated the outdoors. They hated driving. But my brother, Blaine, had been talking for months about how he wanted to buy a luxury RV to travel the country and become a lifestyle influencer, whatever that meant. I looked at the catalog, then at the empty dents in the carpet. I thought they were just being their usual selfish, thoughtless selves. I did not know yet that they had already sold my son's future. How far would you go to protect your child from the people who are supposed to love him? I took Ronan home that afternoon. The drive was entirely silent. He sat in the passenger seat with his head resting against the window, watching the city blur by. He did not ask any questions. He did not complain. He just retreated inward, shutting doors in his mind that I did not know how to open. Seeing him like that felt like taking a knife to the ribs. When we got back to our cramped apartment, he went straight to his room and closed the door. I sat on our worn-out couch, staring at the peeling paint on the ceiling, and let the memories wash over me. I needed to remind myself who I was dealing with. My family is a museum of pain, and every memory is an exhibit I try to avoid visiting. I was always the scapegoat, the invisible son. If I did something right, it was expected. If I made a mistake, it was a character flaw. But my older brother, Blaine, he was the golden child. Blaine could burn a house down, and my mother would praise him for keeping us warm. I remembered my 18th birthday. I had spent 2 years working night shifts at a diner, saving every penny in a rusty coffee can to buy a beat-up, second-hand truck so I could start taking on construction gigs. On the day I finally bought it, I drove it home, proud of the oil stains on my hands. My parents did not even look out the window. But 2 weeks later, for Blaine's 21st birthday, Orson and Veda surprised him with a brand-new, cherry red sports car. They took out a loan to buy it. Blaine totaled it 3 months later, driving drunk into a ditch. My parents did not ground him. They hugged him and cried, saying they were just glad their special boy was safe. Years later, I built my own small business from nothing. I do acoustic soundproofing for recording studios and home theaters. It is hard, physical labor, but it pays the bills and puts food on the table for me and Ronan. When I told my parents I incorporated my business, Orson just laughed and called me a glorified hammer swinger. But Blaine? Blaine opened a trendy fusion restaurant using Orson's retirement money. It failed in 6 months. Then he started a tech consulting firm despite barely knowing how to use a laptop. Failed again. He went bankrupt 3 times, and every single time, Veda would stroke his hair and call him an unlucky entrepreneur who was just ahead of his time. The only person in that family who ever really saw me, was my grandfather, Thaddeus. He was a quiet, sharp-minded man who built a fortune in real estate but lived like a monk. He saw right through Orson's arrogance and Blaine's flashy vanity. And when Ronan was born, Thaddeus saw something special in him too. I closed my eyes and remembered the day Thaddeus first let Ronan touch the antique grand piano. Ronan was just 7. The piano was a masterpiece, built in the early 1900s, with ivory keys and a rich, resonant tone that could make your chest vibrate. Thaddeus had sat next to Ronan on the bench, gently guiding my son's small hands over the keys. "Listen to it breathe," Thaddeus had said, his voice a low rumble. "Sound does not lie, son. It tells the truth even when people do not. Where your heart is, that is where the keys will ring." Ronan had pressed a single chord, and the sound that filled the room was pure magic. Thaddeus had looked at me over Ronan's head and nodded. From that day on, the piano belonged to Ronan. It was an unspoken rule, until Thaddeus moved to the assisted living center and left the instrument under my parents' roof. My phone buzzed, pulling me violently out of the past. I looked at the screen. It was a text message from my cousin Corbin. Corbin was basically Blaine's shadow, a flying monkey who always parroted whatever my parents said to stay in their good graces. The text read, "Hey man, heard you threw a fit at Aunt Veda's house over that dusty old piano today. Stop being so narrow-minded. They are just trying to declutter their own house. Stop making everything about you and your kid. You are stressing them out." I stared at the glowing screen. The manipulation was already starting. The narrative was being spun. I was the crazy, demanding son, and they were the poor, victimized grandparents just trying to clean their living room. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. I did not reply. There was no point. Arguing with a flying monkey only gives the wicked witch more power. But the anger inside me was changing shape. It was no longer a hot, blinding rage. It was turning into ice. I was not going to let them gaslight me. I was not going to let them rewrite reality. If they thought they could crush my son and get away with it, they were dead wrong. But what could I actually do against a family that had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of lying? A week dragged by, heavy and suffocating. The air in our apartment felt thick, like we were breathing underwater. To try and keep Ronan's spirits up, I bought a cheap, second-hand electric keyboard from a pawn shop. It was made of flimsy plastic and half the buttons stuck, but it was all I could afford on short notice. I set it up on a wobbly folding table in the corner of the living room. Ronan did not complain. He never does. He sat down, plugged in his headphones and started to play. But through the cheap plastic casing, I could hear the dry, synthetic clacking of the keys. Click, clack, click. It was a hollow, soulless sound. It sounded like defeat. I watched his shoulders hunch forward, lacking the proud, straight posture he always held at the grand piano. My heart broke a little more with every keystroke. I could not take the waiting anymore. I needed proof. I told Ronan I had to run an errand for work and drove straight back to my parents' house. The sky was overcast, matching the storm brewing in my chest. When I arrived, Orson's car was in the driveway. I marched up to the front door and let myself in. Orson was sitting in his recliner in the living room, watching a golf tournament on television with the volume turned up way too high. The empty space where the piano used to be screamed at me. "Dad," I said, walking over and blocking his view of the screen. "I need the name of the maintenance company. Now." Orson let out a loud, theatrical sigh and muted the television. "Gideon, are you still on about this? I told you they took it to the shop. Give me the receipt," I demanded, crossing my arms. "Give me the receipt, the work order, the name of the shop, or the phone number. Anything. If it is getting fixed, you have a paper trail." Orson's eyes darted away for a fraction of a second. It was a tiny tell, but I caught it. "You do not need to worry about it," he snapped. "I am handling it. You always have to micromanage everything, do you not? Just let the adults handle the furniture." Before I could push harder, the front door swung open. In walked Blaine. He was wearing a designer polo shirt, expensive sunglasses resting on his head, and carrying a cup of iced coffee that probably cost $10. He looked smug, glowing with the kind of unearned confidence that always made me want to punch a wall. "Well, look who it is," Blaine sneered, taking a loud sip of his coffee. "Still crying over spilled milk, little brother? Where is it, Blaine?" I asked, stepping toward him. I knew he was involved. I could smell it on him. Blaine chuckled, walking past me and patting Orson on the shoulder. "Why are you making such a big deal out of it? That piano was a monstrosity. Took up half the living room. Mom and Dad have the right to use their own space. You do not pay their mortgage, Gideon. Stop acting so entitled." "Entitled?" I laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "It is not your piano. It is not their piano. It belongs to Ronan." Blaine rolled his eyes. "He is 12. He does not know the difference between an antique and a toy. Go buy him a synthesizer. Anyway, Dad, I need to borrow the power washer from the garage." Blaine walked toward the garage door, dismissing me entirely. Orson turned the television volume back up, ignoring me. I stood there, invisible again, just the annoying background noise in their perfect lives. I turned around and walked out. But instead of going to my truck, I walked around the side of the house toward the garage. I do not know what compelled me to do it. Call it intuition, call it desperation. I saw the large plastic trash bin sitting by the side door, waiting for garbage day. I lifted the lid. The smell of rotting food and old coffee grounds hit my nose, but I did not care. I started digging. I moved pizza boxes, crumpled up junk mail and empty wine bottles. And then, near the bottom, sticking to a damp newspaper, I found it. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, the heavy kind used for official business. It had been torn open roughly and tossed away. I carefully peeled it off the newspaper and wiped it off. In the top left corner, embossed in gold lettering, was a logo: Silas Vanguard Fine Instruments and Appraisals. And in the center, printed clearly, was the recipient's name. Not Orson. Not Veda. Blaine. My breath caught in my throat. Silas Vanguard was a name I recognized. Thaddeus had mentioned him once. He was a high-end broker, a man who dealt exclusively in museum-quality musical instruments. You do not call Silas Vanguard to fix a sticky piano key. You call Silas Vanguard when you want to sell a masterpiece. I folded the envelope and shoved it deep into my pocket. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely feel my fingers. They had not just thrown it away. They had sold it. My brother had sold my son's inheritance, and my parents had paved the way for him to do it. If you are listening to this and you have ever looked a family member in the eye and known with absolute certainty that they were lying straight to your face to protect themselves, hit the like button. Because in that moment, standing next to the garbage bin, I realized I was no longer dealing with a family. I was dealing with thieves. But the worst part was yet to come. The worst part was finding out what they bought with my son's stolen future. The drive from my parents' house to Blaine's neighborhood took 20 minutes. Felt like 20 hours. My mind was racing, trying to put the pieces together. How did he sell it? He did not own it. How did he get a broker to take it? I needed answers, but first, I needed to see what Blaine was hiding. Blaine lived in a cookie-cutter subdivision where all the houses looked exactly the same, but the lawns were manicured to look like golf courses. It was the kind of neighborhood where people bought things they could not afford to impress neighbors they did not like. I turned onto his street and slowed my truck to a crawl. And there it was. Parked halfway on the grass and halfway on the driveway was a monster made of fiberglass and steel. A massive 40-foot luxury recreational vehicle. It was painted in sleek silver and black, with tinted windows and chrome accents that blinded you in the afternoon sun. It looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in suburbia. I parked my beat-up work truck across the street and just stared at it. The side of the RV had the model name printed in bold letters. I pulled out my phone and searched the make and model. The manufacturer's website loaded slowly. When the price tag finally popped up on the screen, I felt the air leave my lungs. Base price, $185,000. I lowered my phone. Standing outside the RV was Sloane, Blaine's wife. She was wearing designer workout gear, holding her phone up on a selfie stick, spinning in circles. I rolled down my window just enough to hear her shrill voice carrying across the quiet street. "Hey guys," Sloane squealed into her phone camera. "Just wanted to give you a quick sneak peek at our new baby. Hubby's business is booming, and we decided it is time to live our best lives. Next stop, the Grand Canyon. #blessed, #RV life, #boss moves. Boss moves." I tasted bile in the back of my throat. Blaine did not have a booming business. He was drowning in debt. He had leeched off my parents for years. And now he had leeched off a 12-year-old boy. I rolled the window up, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight the leather squeaked. I pulled the envelope out of my pocket and stared at the name. Silas Vanguard. I dialed the phone number listed under the logo. It rang twice before a smooth, professional voice answered. "Vanguard Instruments, Silas speaking." "Mr. Vanguard," I said, forcing my voice to stay level. "My name is Gideon. I am calling regarding a grand piano you recently acquired from a man named Blaine." There was a brief pause on the other end. The tone shifted, becoming slightly guarded. Ah yes, the 1910 concert grand. A magnificent piece. Is there an issue, Gideon? Blaine assured me the family was entirely on board with the liquidation. Liquidation. The word sounded like a gunshot. How much did he sell it to you for? I asked, the words tasting like ash. I cannot disclose exact financial details of a private transaction, Silas said smoothly. But I can tell you it was a very rapid sale. He requested a wire transfer immediately. He provided a notarized letter of authorization signed by the homeowner, Orson. The paperwork was in order. My father signed off on it. My father gave him the permission to sell it. Did he get market value? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Silas hesitated. Between us? No. He took a heavy discount for the speed of the transaction. He walked away with $185,000. Could have fetched much more at auction, but he said he needed the liquid capital urgently. Thank you, Mr. Vanguard, I whispered, and hung up the phone. $185,000. Wired directly to Blaine. Backed by my father's signature. They had sold Ronan's piano at a discount so Blaine could buy a glorified bus to show off on the internet. I drove home in a daze. When I walked into our apartment, the lights were off. The only illumination came from the street lamp shining through the small window in the living room. Ronan was sitting at the wobbly folding table. He had fallen asleep, his head resting on the cheap plastic keys of the electric keyboard. He was still wearing his headphones. I walked over to him. His breathing was soft and even. I gently slipped the headphones off his ears. The keyboard was turned off, but I could see the faint smudges on the plastic where his small fingers had tapped away, trying to recreate the magic that had been stolen from him. I picked him up. He was getting heavy, almost too big to carry, but in that moment he felt fragile. I carried him to his room and laid him in his bed, pulling the blanket up to his chin. He mumbled something in his sleep and turned over. I stood in his doorway for a long time. The blinding, chaotic rage I felt earlier was gone. It had burned itself out. What was left in its place was a cold, calculated fury. It was a dark, quiet place inside me. I was done screaming. I was done asking for their approval. I was going to tear their perfect, fake world apart brick by brick. But I could not do it alone. I needed the one person in this family who actually understood the value of a promise. I needed the king. How do you fight a monster that has the law and the family narrative on its side? You do not fight it. You let it eat itself. The next morning, I did not go to the construction site. I put on a clean shirt, grabbed my keys, and drove out to the edge of the city. The assisted living community where my grandfather lived was not some depressing, sterile hospital ward. It was a sprawling, high-end estate surrounded by manicured gardens and ancient oak trees. It smelled like fresh pine and expensive herbal tea. It was quiet, so quiet, the exact opposite of the chaotic, loud vanity that Blaine surrounded himself with. I walked up to the front desk. The receptionist smiled warmly. Good morning, Gideon. Visiting Mr. Thaddeus today? Yes, please, I replied. He is in the reading solarium, she said, pointing down a sunlit hallway. I found him sitting by a massive bay window, bathed in morning light. Thaddeus was 82 years old, but his posture was as straight as a steel rod. He was wearing a tailored tweed jacket, reading a thick hardcover biography, a magnifying glass resting gently in his free hand. He looked up as my footsteps echoed on the tile floor. His sharp, pale blue eyes locked onto mine. Gideon, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that always demanded respect. You look like a man who has not slept. I pulled up a chair and sat across from him. I did not sleep, Grandpa. He closed his book and placed it on the small table next to him. He folded his hands in his lap and waited. He never rushed anyone. He just watched, analyzing every detail. I told him everything. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I laid out the facts like I was presenting a blueprint. I told him about the empty space in the living room. I told him about Veda's lies about maintenance. I told him about finding the envelope in the trash, the phone call with Silas Vanguard, and the notarized letter Orson had signed. And finally, I told him about the massive, gleaming RV parked on Blaine's lawn, paid for with $185,000 of wired cash. Thaddeus did not flinch. His expression did not change. He did not gasp, or shake his head, or curse their names. He just sat there, perfectly still, absorbing the information. For a terrifying second, I thought he did not care. I thought he was going to tell me to let it go, that it was just an object, that family was more important. Instead, Thaddeus slowly reached for his teacup, took a small, deliberate sip, and set it down without making a sound. A recreational vehicle, Thaddeus said softly, the words dripping with a cold, refined contempt. So Orson and his golden boy have decided to play grown-up games. Grandpa, I said, leaning forward. Blaine sold it. Dad authorized it. They think they got away with it because it was in Dad's house. I do not know what to do. I do not have the money for a lawyer to fight them for a stolen gift. Thaddeus raised a single finger, silencing me instantly. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his reading glasses, sliding them onto his face. Then he picked up his cell phone from the table. You do not need a lawyer, Gideon, Thaddeus said, scrolling through his contacts. I do. He pressed a name and put the phone to his ear. I sat in silence, watching the gears turn behind his sharp eyes. Alden, Thaddeus said into the phone. The voice on the other end was muffled but sounded crisp and alert. Yes, it is Thaddeus. Cancel your morning appointments. We have a breach of asset protocol. Yes. The grand piano. I need you to initiate a freeze and prepare the documentation we drafted in 2019. I will see you in an hour. Thaddeus hung up the phone and placed it back on the table. He looked at me, and for the first time that morning he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just seen a mouse step into a trap. Grandpa, I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. What is going on? Who is Alden? Alden is my estate attorney, Thaddeus replied calmly, taking off his glasses. And Gideon, there is something you need to understand about me. I did not survive 82 years in this world by trusting fools with valuable things. He leaned forward, his blue eyes piercing right through me. That piano did not belong to Orson. It never belonged to Orson. And legally, it did not even belong to me anymore. I stared at him, utterly confused. But Dad signed a letter of authorization. Thaddeus let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Orson is a tenant in his own mind. He signed a piece of paper that holds as much legal weight as a napkin. Your brother just sold an asset he had zero legal right to touch, using forged authority, to a highly documented broker. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands again. I planted a ticking time bomb in the center of their living room years ago. Gideon. I knew Orson's greed. I knew Blaine's vanity. I just waited to see if they would be stupid enough to pull the pin. And yesterday, Blaine pulled it. What happens now? I asked, feeling a strange mix of terror and exhilarating hope. Thaddeus looked out the window at the manicured lawns, his jaw setting into a hard line. Now, we let them enjoy their new toy for a little while. We let them show it off. We let them feel like kings. Because when you knock a man off a pedestal, the fall hurts much worse if you let him climb to the very top first. My grandfather had laid a trap long before I even knew there was a war. And Blaine, in his desperate greed, had walked right into it. You might be wondering what exactly Thaddeus had done to secure the piano, and how a piece of paper was about to destroy my parents' entire reality. The answer is coming, and trust me, the look on my brother's face when the hammer falls is something I will cherish for the rest of my life. 3 weeks went by. 3 long, agonizing weeks where I had to pretend everything was normal. Every day, I went to work, came home, and cooked dinner for Ronan. Every evening, I sat on the couch and listened to him tap away on that cheap, plastic keyboard. The hollow electronic clicking was a constant reminder of what had been stolen from him. But I kept my mouth shut. I did not text my parents. I did not call my brother. I let the silence stretch out, just like my grandfather Thaddeus had instructed. I let them believe they had won. I let them believe they had successfully swept their betrayal under the rug. Then the invitation arrived. It did not come as a thoughtful phone call or a handwritten note. It came as a mass text message sent to the entire extended family, a digital flyer filled with party emojis and exclamation points. It was an invitation to a backyard barbecue at my parents' house, hosted by Blaine. The occasion? The grand unveiling of his new luxury recreational vehicle. My father, Orson, called me the next morning just to make sure I had seen the message. He did not ask how Ronan was doing. He did not ask if I was busy. He simply demanded my attendance. "You need to be there, Gideon," Orson commanded through the phone, his voice thick with that condescending authority he loved to use on me. "It is time you saw what real success looks like. Your brother has worked hard for this. It is a milestone. Bring the boy too. Have a hot dog, relax, and stop holding on to grudges. It is just furniture. We need to celebrate family." I almost laughed out loud. Celebrate family. They wanted me there to serve as the baseline, the struggling younger brother so Blaine could look even taller on his pedestal. They wanted Ronan there so they could pretend they were loving, generous grandparents who provided a fun afternoon of yard games, conveniently ignoring the fact that they had sold the very thing that brought him joy. I told Orson we would be there. I hung up the phone and looked at Ronan, who was sitting at the kitchen table doing his homework. I told him we were going to his grandparents' house for a party. He did not complain, but a shadow crossed his face. I knelt next to his chair and looked him in the eye. "I know it is hard, buddy," I said softly. "I know you do not want to be in that house right now. But I need you to trust me. Wear your nice button-down shirt. Keep your head up. We are going to watch a show today, and I promise you it is going to be worth it." Ronan nodded slowly. He did not understand, but he trusted me. Saturday arrived, hot and thick with humidity, the kind of oppressive summer heat that makes your clothes stick to your back the second you step outside. I drove us to the suburbs, turning onto the familiar street where I had grown up. Cars were parked bumper to bumper along the curb for half a mile. Relatives I had not seen in years, neighbors, and people I barely recognized were all piling into my parents' front yard. And there it was, the center of attention. The massive, silver and black recreational vehicle was parked aggressively on the lawn, crushing Veda's prize-winning petunias. It gleamed in the harsh sunlight like a monument to vanity. We walked up the driveway. The air smelled of expensive barbecue smoke, cheap beer, and a heavy dose of expensive cologne. I held Ronan's hand. He was wearing a crisp white shirt, tucked into dark jeans, looking entirely too mature for a 12-year-old. He kept his eyes straight ahead, refusing to look at the giant metal box on the lawn. The moment we stepped into the backyard, the contrast hit me like a physical blow. The yard was filled with loud, performative laughter. People were holding plastic cups, pointing at the vehicle, patting Blaine on the back. But inside the house, just beyond the sliding glass doors, I could see the living room. The empty space where the piano used to sit was visible through the glass. It was a glaring, hollow void. They were celebrating out here, fueled by the ghost of what they had destroyed in there. My cousin Corbin spotted me almost immediately. He swaggered over, holding a beer, his face already flushed from the heat and the alcohol. "Hey, look who decided to grace us with his presence," Corbin sneered, looking me up and down. "Glad you could take a day off from hammering nails, Gideon." I just smiled politely. "Hello, Corbin." Corbin gestured toward the massive vehicle with his beer cup. "Have you seen the inside yet? Granite countertops, man. 3 flat screens. Blaine really hit it out of the park this time. You should take notes. Maybe if you stop being so stubborn, he could teach you a thing or two about making real money." I looked Corbin dead in the eye, my smile never wavering. "Oh, I am definitely taking notes today, Corbin." He frowned, confused by my calm demeanor, then muttered something under his breath and walked away to join a louder group. I guided Ronan to a quiet corner of the patio, far away from the grill and the center of attention. We stood in the shade, watching the circus unfold. My mother, Veda, was fluttering through the crowd, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat, offering appetizers and soaking in the compliments like a sponge. Every time someone praised the RV, she would touch her chest and say, "Oh, you know our Blaine. He just has such a brilliant mind for business. We are so proud." I checked my watch. The time was getting close. The overture of their vanity was reaching its peak. It was almost time for the curtain to drop. The party grew louder as the afternoon wore on. The heat was stifling, but no one seemed to care. The crowd was gathered around the side of the massive recreational vehicle. Blaine had apparently decided it was time for an official speech. He stood on the automated, fold-out aluminum steps of the RV, holding a microphone connected to a portable karaoke speaker. Orson stood right beside the steps, his chest puffed out like a proud general reviewing his troops. "Can I get everyone's attention?" Blaine called out, tapping the microphone. The screech of feedback echoed through the yard, making several people wince, but the crowd quieted down. Blaine flashed his $1 million smile, the one that had charmed bankers into giving him loans he never paid back. "Wow. Look at all of you. Thank you so much for coming out today. As you all know, the last few years have been a journey. Building a brand, expanding my business portfolio, it takes vision. Takes sacrifice." I felt Ronan shift his weight next to me. I put my hand firmly on his shoulder, keeping him grounded. Sacrifice. The sheer audacity of the word made my blood boil. Blaine had never sacrificed a single thing in his entire life. He just consumed everything around him. But I did not get here alone. Blaine continued, pressing a hand to his chest in a gesture of fake humility. "I want to thank my beautiful wife, Sloane, for her endless support. And of course, the two people who always believed in my vision. Mom, Dad, this is for you as much as it is for me." Veda wiped a dramatic, non-existent tear from her cheek. Orson raised his beer in the air, grinning from ear to ear. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Corbin whistled loudly. It was a sickening display of mutual delusion. They were patting each other on the back, standing on top of my son's stolen legacy. Blaine raised his hands to quiet the crowd again. "We are going to hit the road next week. First stop, the coast. But before we open the doors for the grand tour, I just want to say, clang." The heavy iron latch of the backyard gate echoed over the crowd. The sound was sharp and metallic, slicing right through Blaine's speech. Every head in the yard turned toward the noise. The wooden gate swung open slowly. The chatter in the yard died instantly. Standing in the entryway was my grandfather, Thaddeus. He was dressed immaculately in a dark, tailored suit despite the sweltering heat, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane. He looked like a judge arriving at a courthouse. Next to him stood Alden, his estate attorney. Alden was a tall, severe-looking man with graying temples, wearing wire-rimmed glasses. In his right hand, Alden gripped a thick, black leather briefcase. The silence that fell over the yard was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens when the air pressure suddenly drops before a massive storm. You could hear the hum of the pool pump and the distant chirp of a bird, but not a single human made a sound. Veda's fake smile froze on her face. Her eyes darted from Thaddeus to the briefcase and then to Orson. Orson lowered his beer, his chest deflating rapidly. Blaine stood frozen on the steps of his RV, the microphone still held halfway to his mouth. Thaddeus stepped onto the patio. He did not look at Veda. He did not look at Orson. His cold, piercing blue eyes locked directly onto Blaine. The crowd naturally parted, stepping back to create a clear path for him. It was instinctual. People knew better than to stand in Thaddeus's way. Veda tried to salvage the situation. She stepped forward, forcing her voice to sound bright and cheerful, though it trembled slightly. "Dad, what a surprise. We did not think you would want to make the trip in this heat. Let me get you a glass of lemonade, you must be exhausted." Thaddeus did not even blink. He stopped walking and rested both hands on the top of his cane. "I do not want your lemonade, Veda," Thaddeus said. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the quiet yard like thunder. "And I am not exhausted. I am here for a very specific reason." He slowly turned his head, surveying the massive, gleaming vehicle parked on the lawn. He looked at the chrome, the tinted windows, and the tacky, personalized license plate that read Boss Life. "Well," Thaddeus said, his voice dripping with icy disdain, "this is quite a monument. A very shiny, very expensive monument. Orson stepped forward, trying to assert some kind of dominance in his own backyard. Dad, please. This is a celebration. Let us not do this in front of everyone. We can talk inside. Thaddeus finally looked at Orson. The disgust in his eyes was so potent I almost felt bad for my father. Almost. We are not going inside, Orson, Thaddeus replied smoothly, because there is nothing left inside to talk about. The living room is empty. Is it not? A low murmur rippled through the crowd of relatives. People started shifting uncomfortably, realizing they were suddenly trapped in the middle of a family execution. Blaine swallowed hard, the microphone dropping to his side. Grandpa, listen. No, you listen, Thaddeus commanded, cutting him off instantly. You have done enough talking, Blaine. It is time for you to hear exactly how the real world works. I looked down at Ronan. His eyes were wide, watching his great-grandfather take control of the entire yard with nothing but his presence. The king had arrived, and the thieves were finally cornered. Thaddeus stood tall, leaning his weight casually on his cane, though there was nothing casual about the atmosphere. The heat seemed to evaporate, replaced by a chilling tension that held every single guest hostage. No one dared to move toward the exit. No one dared to speak. I heard you sold the piano, Thaddeus said, his voice ringing out with crystal clarity. Blaine's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He gripped the handrail of the RV steps. Grandpa, it was taking up too much room. Mom and Dad needed the space. It was just gathering dust. I took the initiative. It is a family asset, and we repurposed the funds to build something that benefits all of us. Repurpose the funds, Thaddeus repeated slowly, rolling the words around like a bad taste in his mouth. You sold an antique instrument, a piece of art, for $185,000. To a broker named Silas Vanguard. A collective gasp echoed from a few aunts and uncles in the back. $185,000. Hearing the number spoken out loud made the crime real to everyone listening. Orson stepped up, crossing his arms defensively. Dad, I signed off on it. It is my house. I have the right to clear out old furniture. Gideon was just letting his kid bang on it anyway. We needed the room, and Blaine needed the capital to launch his new lifestyle brand. It was a father helping his son. Thaddeus let out a sharp, terrifying laugh. A father helping his son. By stealing from his grandson. How poetic. Thaddeus turned slightly and nodded to Alden. The lawyer stepped forward, placing the heavy leather briefcase on a nearby patio table. The loud click of the metal latches popping open sounded like a gun cocking. Alden pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in a blue legal folder. Mr. Vanguard reached out to me on Thursday, Alden began, his voice professional, devoid of any emotion. He was very concerned when I informed him of the true ownership of the instrument he had just purchased. Blaine's eyes widened. What are you talking about? Dad signed the paper. Dad owned it. Alden adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Blaine. Orson did not own the piano. Thaddeus did not own the piano. That instrument was legally transferred 4 years ago into a generation-skipping irrevocable trust. The sole named beneficiary of that trust is Ronan. Thaddeus serves as the active trustee. The silence returned, heavier this time. I felt Ronan squeeze my hand. I squeezed back, a fierce smile finally breaking across my face. An irrevocable trust means the asset is protected by federal and state law, Alden continued, reading from the document. It cannot be altered, moved, or liquidated without the explicit, notarized signature of the trustee, which means the letter of authorization your father signed is legally void. It is fraudulent. Orson's arms dropped to his sides. His face went pale. Wait, what? It means, Thaddeus interrupted, taking a step toward the RV, that you did not sell a family asset, Blaine. You committed grand larceny. You sold a protected asset that belonged to a 12-year-old boy. You committed wire fraud by accepting those funds across state lines. And Orson, you are an accessory to fraud for forging legal authority you did not possess. Veda let out a short, panicked shriek, pressing her hands to her mouth. Blaine, she gasped, looking at her golden child. Blaine was shaking his head rapidly, stepping down from the stairs. No, no, no. You cannot do this. We are family. You are making a mistake, Grandpa. Silas already took the piano. It is a done deal. Silas Vanguard is a very reputable man, Alden said, closing the folder. He does not deal in stolen goods. When I provided him with the trust documentation, he immediately surrendered the piano to secure storage, pending legal resolution. And he filed a formal police report for fraud against you, Blaine. The authorities are currently reviewing the wire transfer logs. Blaine's legs seemed to give out. He stumbled back against the side of the shiny recreational vehicle, his face draining of all color. He looked at Orson for help, but Orson was staring at the ground, paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his reality. You thought you were clever? Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that still somehow reached every ear. You thought because Gideon is a good man, a patient man, that you could walk all over him. You thought because Ronan is a child, his talent and his future did not matter as much as your pathetic vanity. You thought you were untouchable. Thaddeus tapped his cane hard against the concrete patio. You are not untouchable, Blaine. You are just a thief. And today is the day you pay the bill. Before we continue to the final fallout and the second massive twist that my grandfather had waiting for them, I want to pause. If you are thrilled to see this arrogant thief finally get what he deserves, drop a W in the comments down below. That W stands for win, the mark of everyone who stayed for the justice they deserve. I will be hearting and replying to every single comment with that letter. Now, let us get back to the absolute destruction of Blaine's perfect life. The backyard was a scene of utter devastation. Guests were slowly backing away, gathering their purses and whispering to each other, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Corbin, who had been mocking me an hour earlier, was suddenly extremely interested in inspecting the grass near the fence, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Blaine was breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his face despite the shade of the RV. He wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. Okay, he stammered, trying to inject some fake confidence back into his voice. Okay, fine. If the sale is void, then fine. Silas can keep the piano and I will just keep the RV. The dealer already got paid. The money is spent. You cannot undo that. Orson nodded eagerly, grasping at straws. Exactly. The money was transferred. The dealer was paid in full. The vehicle is Blaine's property now. You can yell all you want, Dad, but the transaction is finished. Thaddeus looked at Orson with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. Alden, Thaddeus said quietly, please explain to my son how the banking system works. Alden opened the briefcase again and pulled out a different folder. This one was red. When Mr. Vanguard realized the transaction was fraudulent, he immediately contacted his bank to initiate a fraud freeze on the wire transfer, because the amount exceeded $100,000. The federal banking authorities placed an automatic, mandatory freeze on the receiving account. Blaine's eyes bulged. No, my account is fine. I checked it this morning. You checked your personal checking account, Alden corrected him. The wire transfer was sent to an escrow account managed by the RV dealership. That account has been frozen. The funds have not cleared. Orson frowned, stepping forward. What does that mean? It means, Alden said patiently, the dealership never received the $185,000. A profound, suffocating silence gripped the yard. The shiny metal box parked on the grass suddenly did not look like a trophy anymore. It looked like a tombstone. Sloane, Blaine's wife, who had been hiding behind her husband, suddenly shoved him forward. Blaine, she shrieked, her influencer voice completely gone, replaced by pure panic. You told me it was paid for. You told me it was in cash. It was. Blaine yelled back, his voice cracking. I paid for it. I signed the paperwork. Yes, you signed the paperwork, Alden agreed. But since the cash wire was delayed, and you insisted on taking delivery of the vehicle immediately to host this gathering, you had to sign a bridge loan agreement with the dealership's financing department. Blaine covered his face with his hands. He looked like he was going to vomit. A bridge loan? Orson muttered, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray. A bridge loan for $185,000. That is correct, Alden said. And because Blaine's credit history shows 3 previous bankruptcies, the dealership required a guarantor with significant collateral. Alden turned his head slowly and looked directly at Orson. Orson's mouth dropped open. The beer cup slipped from his fingers, hitting the concrete patio and splashing warm liquid across his expensive leather shoes. I just co-signed, Orson stammered, his hands shaking violently. I just co-signed the bridge loan to help him get it off the lot for the party. You did more than co-sign, Orson, Thaddeus said, stepping forward. You used the equity in this house as collateral to secure his loan. You bet the roof over your head on your golden boy's ability to clear a stolen wire transfer. Veda let out a long, horrifying wail and sank into a patio chair, burying her face in her hands. But it is fine, Orson yelled, panic completely taking over his body. It is my house. I have the equity. I can pay it off over time. I own this property. Thaddeus smiled. It was the coldest thing I have ever seen. No, Orson, you do not. Alden pulled a final piece of paper from the red folder. He held it up by the corner. When you filed for bankruptcy in 1998, your father, Thaddeus, purchased this property to save you from foreclosure. He allowed you to live here. He allowed you to pay the property taxes. But he never transferred the deed back into your name. Orson stared at the paper like it was a venomous snake. Thaddeus is the sole legal owner of this property. Alden continued relentlessly, which means your collateral agreement with the dealership is fraudulent. The loan is in default as of this morning. The dealership has already dispatched a repossession team for the vehicle. They should be arriving shortly. Blaine fell to his knees on the grass. Sloane burst into hysterical tears and ran into the house. Alden stepped forward and handed the piece of paper to Orson. Orson's hands were shaking so hard he could barely take it. What is this? Orson whispered. That is a formal notice to vacate, Alden said smoothly. 60 days. Thaddeus is selling the property. You and Veda have 60 days to remove your belongings and find alternative housing. You sold a child's future for scrap metal, Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a final, devastating tone. Now you can pack your bags and leave with it. I looked at my brother, kneeling in the dirt next to his repossessed dream. I looked at my parents, their entire fake, boastful world shattered into pieces in less than 10 minutes. I did not feel pity. I felt peace. 60 days is not a lot of time to pack up 30 years of lies. But it is exactly enough time to watch an empire crumble. The fallout from the backyard barbecue was swift and merciless. The repossession tow truck arrived 30 minutes after Thaddeus and Alden left the party. The remaining relatives stood in awkward, horrified silence as 2 men hooked chains to the front axle of the luxury recreational vehicle and dragged it off the lawn, leaving deep, muddy trenches in Veda's perfect grass. Blaine sat on the front porch with his head between his knees, refusing to look up as his boss moves were towed away down the street. Sloane did not stay long. She packed her designer bags that very night, called an Uber, and left. 2 weeks later, Blaine was served with divorce papers. He also had to hire a criminal defense attorney to deal with the fraud charges pressed by Silas Vanguard. Since the piano was recovered safely, the police ultimately allowed him to plead down to a lesser charge, but he was left with massive legal fees, a mountain of debt, and a permanent criminal record. He moved into a cheap motel on the highway, working night shifts at a warehouse to pay his lawyers. Orson and Veda fared no better. The illusion of their wealth was entirely shattered. The family members who used to flock to their house for free food and drinks suddenly stopped calling. Corbin avoided them like the plague. Without the deed to the house, and with their savings depleted by years of funding Blaine's failures, my parents had nowhere to go. They ended up renting a tiny, cramped 1-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of town. There was no room for Veda's vanity, and no audience for Orson's arrogance. They were forced to taste the very same rejection and dismissal they had fed me for my entire life. As for me and Ronan, our lives changed in a way I could never have imagined. On the 59th day, I drove my work truck to the house. The moving vans were gone. Orson and Veda had left the keys on the kitchen counter. I walked through the empty rooms, the house echoing with a hollow, cleansing silence. I stood in the living room, looking at the dents in the carpet where the piano used to be. An hour later, a heavy transport truck pulled into the driveway. Silas Vanguard's team carefully unloaded the antique grand piano. They rolled it back into the living room, placing it exactly where it belonged. Silas himself oversaw the delivery. He shook my hand, apologized for the stress, and assured me the instrument was in perfect condition. Then Alden arrived. He walked into the living room, opened his black briefcase, and handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside was a new deed. Thaddeus had not sold the house to a stranger. He had transferred the property into the irrevocable trust, designating me as the property manager and Ronan as the ultimate owner. We did not just get the piano back. We got the home that was built around it. The next evening, I brought Ronan to the house. I did not tell him what was waiting. I just told him we needed to check on some things. He walked through the front door, cautious and quiet, expecting to see his grandparents. Instead, he saw the grand piano, polished and gleaming under the warm light of the living room. Ronan froze, his breath hitched in his throat. He looked at me, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. I just smiled and nodded toward the bench. "Go ahead," I whispered. "It is yours. It will always be yours." He ran to the bench, sitting down with a grace and posture that had been missing for over 2 months. He raised his hands, closed his eyes, and pressed the keys. The sound that filled the room was not the synthetic, hollow clack of cheap plastic. It was a rich, deep, thundering chord that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. The music swelled, filling every corner of the house, driving out the last lingering shadows of Orson, Veda, and Blaine. Thaddeus moved in with us a week later. We prepared the master bedroom for him on the first floor. Every evening, he would sit in his armchair by the window, sipping his tea, listening to Ronan play. There were no more complaints about the noise, no more snide comments about the space. The house finally belonged to the people who knew how to appreciate the music. Sometimes, being the invisible son, the scapegoat, feels like a curse. You spend years wondering why you are not enough, why your hard work is ignored while the golden child is showered with praise for simply breathing. But looking back, I realize it was a blessing. Because when you are invisible, they never see you coming. They never expect the quiet one to be the one who finally tears their house of cards down. So, what do you think? Did my grandfather and I go too far by taking the house and leaving my parents and brother with absolutely nothing? Or was it the only fair price to pay for trying to steal a child's future just to buy a shiny toy? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you made it to the end of the story, thank you for listening. Do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories of dealing with toxic family members in the comments. We read every single one. Until next time, stay strong, protect the ones you love, and never let anyone tell you to play small.